It's a five-way race for Hawaii's first congressional seat covering urban Honolulu to Kapolei and Mililani. Former Congressman Ed Case beat 6 competitors to win the Democratic nomination. Former state lawmaker Cam Cavasso beat his lone competitor to win the Republican nomination. Also challenging for the seat are Green Party candidate Zachary Burd, Libertarian Michelle Tippens, and non-partisan candidate Calvin Griffin. Tonight's live broadcast and live stream of Insights on PBS Hawaii start now.
Aloha and welcome to Insights on PBS Hawaii. I'm Laura Yamada. Well, next year on January 3rd at noon in Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Colleen Hanabusa will officially end her term in Congress, and a new representative for the 1st Congressional District of Hawaii will be sworn in. There are 5 candidates running for the office, representing a myriad of political parties in the state. Tonight, we're going to hear from all of the candidates whose names will be on the ballot. We look forward to your participation in tonight's show. You can email, call, tweet your questions as always, and you'll find a live stream of this program at pbshawaii.org and the PBS Hawaii Facebook page. Okay, our group of volunteers, which tonight includes the Kiwanis Club of the Alakai Young Professionals. Hello, everyone. They are standing by to take your questions. Excited bunch. They're looking forward to you guys calling in. So please keep them busy. Lots of folks watching from across the state. Okay, now to our guests. Michelle Rose Tippens is the nominee for the Libertarian Party. She is an Army veteran and a founder of Hawaii Veterans Cannabis Alliance. Ed Case is the Democratic nominee. He is a former congressman and state lawmaker and is currently a senior management at Outrigger Hotels. Zachary Burd is representing the Green Party. He is an inventor, a scientist, and an engineering student. He's from California and moved here a while ago, back in 2007. Next is Cam Cavasso, the Republican nominee. He served 3 terms in the legislature, is also an Army veteran, and a financial advisor. And Calvin Griffin is running as a nonpartisan. He also served in the military in both active duty and in the reserves. He's a small business owner and is also an inventor. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. A lot of issues to talk about, so we're going to go ahead and just dive right into some of the many, many issues at hand. So let's start with this one. Let's talk about entitlement programs. Do you think the government should protect so-called entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, and are there reforms that are needed? Your thoughts on that? Anybody want to jump in?
Well, I'll jump in. Absolutely. These are key programs in our country. These are some of the most successful programs in our country's history. They are highly valued. They are highly necessary to a whole group of our citizens, and they are absolutely essential to basic life for many, many, especially Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid for that matter. Now, having said that, they are on an unsustainable fiscal path right now. They are basically spending more than they're bringing in. Over time. Now, it's not something that's going to, end tomorrow or anything like that. But, one of the jobs of being in Congress, of being a national leader, is to look far out into the future and say, if I know that something's going to happen 20 years from now on this path, can I do something today that's going to help for that not to happen 20 years? And in the case of Social Security and Medicare, that's our horizon. So clearly, we do have to put them on a fiscally sustainable path.
We've made promises, if I can add to that. We've made promises for Social Security and Medicare. As a people in the government, we must keep our promises, but we also must find a way to fund those difficulties that are coming ahead, to make sure that we don't break our budget and we take care of our people and not break our budget at the same time. So we're going to need an economy that does well. We need leadership that's helping an economy grow, businesses that will grow, and the United States will become stronger.
Thoughts?
I think that the Hawaiian people kind of pioneered the way long before we came in, where they recognized the need for sustainability in everything they did to preserve their ability to maintain the culture and the society, right? And it's just like Ed and Cam are talking about, it's really important to look at the sustainability of the program and not just simply, yes, we need it, right? Of course we need it. We need to support people that are in need, and we recognize that as a society, but where is that coming from? And how are we spending the money? And where is it really going? And it's not just the program, because the program isn't the program that, or not the only program allotted, right? So you have this huge budget. if we're misappropriating money other places, it's going to cost us in those programs too. So really, I think everybody probably has a similar feel about really getting it sustainable. I think we're all kind of unified with that.
Yeah, I think a lot, of course, it should be sustained. But I think a lot of people are concerned about the future, you know, the possibility, the way things are going, the society is changing. We have a number of new people coming into the country for whatever reason. And there are a lot of people concerned that possibly when their time comes for the things that they've already put into the system, that it won't be there, you know. So again, you're looking into, you know, down the future, as Mr. Case says, about what can be done to make sure it is sustainable. But people are afraid. I mean, they're concerned deeply about what's happening, and rightfully so. You know, and again, about trying to make sure that it's not misappropriated or diverted to other programs that they're not called for.
Your thoughts, Zach?
Well, yeah, obviously it's a difficult, you know, mathematical problem when you have the increasing population and then there's less and less, you know, like you're saying, less and less money actually. It's like inflation, you know, the age of retirement gets higher and higher, and some people, you know, some people have to retire later. Like you're saying, immigrant groups, you know, some people don't get to retire till they're 75, and some people 65 or younger. So there's different, you know, there's different problems. It's you know, it's difficult mathematical kind of a situation.
Complicated, no doubt. All right, let's talk about a hot button issue. This is having to do with the Trump administration's zero tolerance approach to illegal immigration. Pretty much headlining for I don't know how many days now at this point in time. What are your thoughts, and what might you do differently?
Well, I think what Mr. Trump had expressed, illegal immigration. And I think one of the things that he has expressed as far as legal immigration, people coming in, welcoming these individuals to our country, because basically in the past, the immigrants have made a lot of contributions to our country. If in fact, most of us are immigrants in one form or another anyhow, you know. But yeah, I think that of course we're concerned about certain individuals who may be coming here to not contribute to the society, but, you know, in a way be a drain. And I think you have to have a careful balance between those individuals who are coming here to assimilate and those who are coming here for other reasons that are not conducive to our culture of society.
I mean, you can take any part of the immigration debate and isolate on just that part, but it's not going to solve the problem if you simply look at that part. What we need is comprehensive immigration reform and overall reform of our immigration system, which we have not done for decades now, and which has been long, long overdue. This is another example of how if we had actually started to fix this problem 20 years ago, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in today. We've kicked this can down the road. We haven't addressed it because the two parties in Congress and others don't want to come to the middle ground and try to fix it. For immigration reform, we need a couple of things. First of all, for me, an increase in legal immigration, because I think immigration has been good for our country. It's been good for our state. It's been good for our country. So I'm not one of those that says no more immigration.
What do you mean when you say an increase in legal immigration?
That is that we welcome more immigrants to our country than we have been welcoming. We have the walls up right now, and that has not been our history. That has not been what's made America great. What has made America great is to bring in many different people throughout the course of our history to assimilate, to come in, to bring their own ideas, to bring their own cultures, and to make a incredibly strong country. That's number one. Number two, we do have to secure our borders. And, you know, President Trump is on the right path there. I think the borders are too porous, and I think that's one of the problems. I just don't agree with his methods for having secured the border. So I think zero tolerance is, you know, nice to throw out there in the papers, but impractical, and certainly had extremely difficult and tragic consequences in terms of family separation. And then finally, a path to citizenship for legitimate, worthy people that may not have come here legally to start with. So you've got to have all three of those elements put together. You've got to have comprehensive immigration reform on all of those fronts. That will solve some of the very specific issues that we're dealing with right now.
Michelle, want to jump in?
Oh, yeah, of course. I think that in any instance, a zero tolerance, anything, is probably a bad idea. Even our law structure recognizes mitigating circumstances. And so I think that that's really important. Even in Florida, we recognize that people who are coming refugee style, once they hit land, they've made it to an asylum place, and we have to recognize that sometimes we do exist as that type of asylum for people who are being you know, put in a refugee kind of position where they're running from, you know, they're looking for political asylum, for example, from Cuba. I don't even know if Cuba is still that bad anymore. I think we've gotten a lot down there, but it's still conflicted, you know, and so I think zero tolerance is a bad idea just overall, because it really does ignore that there's so much gray to this area. There's no black and white, you know, people are looking for somewhere safe a lot of times. They're not looking to hurt us, they're looking to hide from something that's harming them. So.
One of the most important responsibilities of our president is to defend our nation, to protect us from those who would have harm intended against us. Our borders must be protected, and the president is doing a good job of initiating the protection that has been let go too long. We must vet those coming in. Yes, we are a nation of immigrants, a nation of people that come from all over, and we want that, but not at the expense of our safety
What do
and
you mean by
protection.
doing a good job? Can you tell specifically
Sure.
what you're referring to, that you agree with what he's done
He's
so
bringing
far?
it out in the open. He's bringing out the need in the open. He is identifying the difficulties that have been presented to the immigration and control agents, ICE, those who are protecting our borders. He is addressing the issue. For 8 long years, we did not address immigration dangers to our country. We must be careful and invite people in that we have vetted, that want to live according to our U.S. Constitution, obey the laws of our land, and be contributing to our economy and to our people and to our community.
Do you want to jump in, Zach?
Well, I actually do have quite a different view, I think, from most people, quite the opposite view. I really don't, I don't agree that the border wall or these restrictions on coming and going, the free travel of people is even legal. You know, as far as from my point of view, I recognize the right of workers, of people all over the world to go where they want, travel where they want, get work where they want, live where they want, and that this idea that we're gonna, you know, build some wall and keep people out, and it's quite different from my perspective. Yeah.
Zach, all nations protect themselves. We are probably the most unprotected nation, and we need to protect our borders. We need to protect ourselves as a nation.
Yeah.
Wanted to add something, Calvin?
Yeah, but I think one of the questions that should be asked when we have these individuals coming to the country, why are they coming here in the first place? What caused them to leave their own countries? Does it have something to do with the policies that we have put in place or have been in place for a long time? You know, if anything, people say, well, okay, you left your country. Is there anything that we could have done before you left to make your situation better, or something that you could have contributed to in your own society? You know, it's nice having people come in, but under what circumstance? Again, we're talking about the national security issues, things of that nature. But we have to look at the bigger picture. What caused this in the first place? And I think that we need to seriously, as a nation, look at some of the policies that have been put in place, past, present, and future.
A lot of questions here on my sheet, but there's a lot of questions coming in from viewers too, so I'm going to get to some of this. This is from the Drug Policy Forum of Hawaii. Do you favor ending federal marijuana prohibition?
Yes. Yes. God. I can
Done.
Elaborate, but yes is the quick answer.
I favor taking marijuana off of the federal list. That's what I favor. I think that at this point in the course of our history, that states are entitled to make their own decisions on marijuana. And I think that is a state's issue. I think that's legitimately a state's issue. Some states have decided to legalize it. Some states have decided to legalize it for medical purposes. Some states have decided that they're not ready for that yet. I think states can do that. Here in Hawaii, we've gone to medical marijuana, I think rightly, by the way. But yet the listing of marijuana as a Class A drug on the federal list it creates incredible hurdles to actually implement legitimate medical marijuana for people that really need it. You know, banks can't lend to them. You know, they have to go through the regulatory hoops, and you know, frankly, I think that should be up to Hawaii to decide exactly how to do that. You know, if California and Colorado and Oregon want to go in a different direction, and maybe we'll go there someday. But for now, I think the federal government ought to get out of the business, at least with marijuana.
Anybody else?
Well, I think, yes, you know, I'm Green Party, so definitely support legalization or decriminalization of cannabis. I think that when you're talking about cannabis, you're going to quickly get away from a discussion about the qualities or properties of the plant itself, and you're going to start talking about alcohol, tobacco, and firearms related issues, you know, kind of the relationship between cottage industrialism, organized crime, and, you know, the legitimate business economy, and how much, you know, basic questions about, well, should people be allowed to grow something in their backyard and sell it? You're getting into questions about taxation and regulation, and so basically the question of would you support legalization? I would answer yes, but not as quickly as you know. If you're looking at
the question was about ending federal marijuana prohibition, I would assume then you would.
In general, in theory, yes, but you have to look at the specific what's being tacked on to the actual bills of what, you know, what type of regulations, what are we talking about, taxation, these types of things. Like in California, you know, they're going to start to say, oh, well, you can, they're going to make certain rules and they're going to try and control it. Basically, I think it should be just the same as tobacco, you know, or you're smoking a smelly cigar or something. It shouldn't be, well, there's a lot of issues. It'd be talking a long time about this, but
it's a complicated issue.
Taking up too much time for you.
Calvin, your thoughts?
The thing I'd say is that, yeah, I agree that it should be up to the states to decide what policies they're going to have. Because a lot of times what happens is when the federal government gets involved, it's overkill. You know, either they want to overtax you, or they want to overregulate it, or they want to some form of retribution or whatever, you know. And I think that it should be up to the states' rights to determine their destiny as far as certain issues, especially with marijuana.
Cam?
I'm concerned about the lead on to the drug epidemic we're having in the nation. And it's a simple question on marijuana, but it comes down to concern for the epidemic that we are having in the nation. And there are many that believe and feel that the use of marijuana leads to the use of opioids. Opioids.
It's a little tough,
and will get us, yeah. And so I'm withholding my view on this at this point. I'm concerned. I am concerned
that being a gateway drug.
That being a gateway drug.
If I may, Lynn.
And I would need to listen to a lot more before I would take the chance on
ending federal prohibition.
Yeah.
Well, DARE, in fact, in the last 2 years has withdrawn their designation of marijuana as a gateway drug. So I encourage you to look at it again, because that actually, DARE no longer calls marijuana a gateway drug.
You know, I'm also concerned about another issue that regarding to marijuana, and that's in Colorado. I understand that the amount of accidents have gone up radically due to marijuana use. And
has that been defined?
I understand that it's as high as 20% greater. Results that I've heard. I don't know all the results yet, but I have preliminary results that we're having problems in Colorado.
I've looked for them. I'll try to see if I can find them again.
Well, I mean, you know, that's exactly what this...
Well, let's move on. I'm so sorry. We do have a lot of questions. So let's talk about this one. Another, we don't have who it's from, but it's having to do with the housing shortage. What will candidates do about the individuals who are in Hawaii illegally or with expired visas who are taking up housing? That's the way the question was posed. That's the way the question was posed.
Well,
your thoughts on that?
Sure. I think you know, first of all, this goes back to an earlier discussion, which is basic border security and the ability to determine who is coming into our country and under what circumstances. And you know, again, I'm completely in favor of legal immigration, but I recognize that a country does have the right to enforce its laws in terms of admission for immigration, or for that matter, for visitors. And so the problem starts because people are here without legal authority, and they overstrain resources. And obviously everybody in Hawaii knows how overstrained our housing resources are to start with. So to me, it starts with better enforcement of people coming here to start with. I mean, it's got to start there. After you get past that, then clearly for the federal programs, at least that we're talking about, which are focused on affordable housing, for example, Section 8, low-income housing, which many people in Hawaii depend on for their basic living. I mean, I met a Marine Corps veteran in Waipahu who lives in Section 8 housing on an amazingly small amount of money. I mean, if he doesn't have that Section 8, he doesn't have a place to live. And so clearly, those programs need to have a qualification that shows legal status to be entitled to those programs.
Let's see if anybody else wants to jump in on this one. What will candidates do about the individuals who are in Hawaii illegally, or with expired visas who are taking up housing? One of the questions posed. Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
Is it public housing or just housing, period? I guess housing, period.
I don't know. The viewer didn't say.
Well, because
your thoughts in general.
You have to look at where the responsibility lies for enforcement. So if you have public housing, of course, you have an authority and a governmental structure, like Ed's talking about. Whereas when you have a private rental, for example, if the landlord, specifically that individual, is not putting forward that information, oh, these people are applying but they have an expired visa, then there's really literal control that the government has to regulate and enforce. But, you know, I guess we could put something in place regarding eviction. You know, if you're being evicted or you're not paying your rent and you're being put out and you have an expired visa, then we've caught you and it's time to send you back where you came from. I mean, I come from a border state and they're very prompt to send people back home. So, and if you're here on a visa, you realize that you had to go back home at a certain point. So,
well, let's talk about
another.
I think
Michelle is correct in that we must be a state and a nation of laws. We cannot be a lawless nation or state, and we need to enforce our immigration laws. And if someone is here illegally, the process should be initiated to send them home, as Michelle said.
In a perfect world, that might work fine. But some of the things I came across as far as information, I talked to people who've been in the system, as far as housing. And you got individuals who are well off in their own country. Because they know somebody here within the system, they are moved to the head of the line. There are even ways, like say, they have been instructed, like say, how to do this. We're talking about as far as with the monies and everything else, the monies are available for the homeless situation. But again, you have individuals who are definitely overqualified, do not belong in the programs. And the thing is, you have to, like say, as far as enforcement, you have to find out who's instituting this, who's overseeing it, to find out, like say, what's going on. That's a major problem, I believe, over here that's not adequately being addressed, you know? So yeah, you have the housing situation. If there's someone here that's not here illegally, let's find out in the system, like say, who dropped the ball on this thing? All right, they didn't just walk through the door, swim on in the Waikiki, jump on the bus, and found a house. That was it, you know. So we have to find out who's in charge, who's responsible.
Let's move on to another issue. Let's talk about taxes, because everybody loves to talk about taxes. Last year, Congress passed a sweeping overhaul of the U.S. tax system. Do you feel that was good for the country?
Yes.
Your thoughts?
Very good.
You're ready to jump in.
I am.
Go ahead.
You know, for the average family in Hawaii, we're realizing almost a $2,000 annual rebate or savings on their taxes. $2,000 goes a long way. In 10 years, it's more than enough to buy a car. And I'll say that on the Democratic side, Pelosi and the people affiliated with the Democrats would like to take that away. And I look to go to Washington to hold the line, to keep these tax benefits in place and not allow Pelosi and the Democrats to take them away. I'm glad for what we have. And our people are just better off in Hawaii and the nation for the tax bill that was passed by Republicans. I
think depending on where you are in the tax bracket, people are having different experiences.
I would not have voted for the tax cuts of last year. I have voted for tax cuts in my prior service in Congress, and I voted against them. Every single tax cut you face has the same basic analysis from my perspective. Is it fair? And will it have a desired outcome that is good for the country, not just for one group? And is it affordable? Is it affordable from a budget perspective? I thought that the tax cuts, now, and the other thing to recognize about taxes is that when you have a 1,000-page tax bill, it's going to benefit some people. And so I completely agree that the tax bill that was passed last year benefited some very much, including the people that Cam referred to. The problem with that tax bill is that the primary beneficiaries were people that didn't need any benefit from a tax cut at all. It was just a straight giveaway, number one. It was special interest all the way to pay off wealthy donors from others. Absolutely, it happened. And third, Cam, and I think you would have to agree with this, it was completely fiscally irresponsible. You talk about a balanced budget. That tax bill last year blew the budget by billions, if not trillions of dollars. It was not balanced. It did not pay for itself. And nobody who talks about a balanced budget can say in any good faith that that tax bill balanced out.
I know Cam wants to jump in, but I want to give this side of the table just a chance to jump in.
I think most people that I speak to would just agree that the budget and the spending is kind of just out of control, just period. I think it all needs to be revamped and looked at again. I mean, tax cuts are put out where the government thinks it will function best, you know, and that's something we deal with. It's just like redrawing district lines. Sometimes it has to happen. But I think that we're far away from getting our taxes right, you know. A lot of people have loopholes that don't need it. We both Ed and Cam talk about this, that some people get tax cuts that don't need it. Some people get benefited in ways that are unfair, and some people get hurt in ways that are unfair. And I think it's really important to make sure that people can maintain a living wage and pay their taxes. And I think that maybe that's where we need to start.
Do you want to jump in, Zach?
I'm actually not really familiar with the specifics of the tax cuts of the last year, but I think that you know, I agree partly with both of them that you know, I agree with Cam that you know, we should always try and lower taxes, and that should be our goal, to have, you know, as little tax as possible. And that I also agree with Ed that we should be wary of looking at the specifics of, you know, where the money's actually going.
Yeah. As far as taxes, like, yeah, it gets very confusing and convoluted and everything else. But the one thing you want to get back to, it seems like we're always having tax increases. All right, why? You know, where's the money going to, and where is it being mishandled or whatever? You know, because we're drowning as far as overall, along with the state, nationwide. That again, we got to find out why we need these increases. And like I said again, as far as being fair, you know, that's another thing.
Well, I know Cam is chomping at the bit. I need to move on to the next question. If you want to tag on into the end of it, you can. Okay, we're going to talk about tariffs, another complicated issue. A lot in the news right now with what's happening with NAFTA. If you want to call it NAFTA, if you don't want to call it NAFTA, we're not quite sure how that's going to be defined in the near future. But your thoughts? Do you agree with the Trump administration's approach actually, I'm sorry. My reference was to trade. Excuse me. I'm going to go ahead and finish with that thought then. That's been in the news a lot about NAFTA and the North American Free Trade Agreement. Do you agree with what's been happening as far as whether the Trump administration's position on making it more exclusive to Mexico, or do you feel that Canada should be included? Where this is going?
You know, that happened today, that the agreement was signed between Mexico and the United States, and Canada came into it. So President Trump has taken the right initiative. He has broken the unfairness of the trade between Mexico and Canada. And Mexico has now agreed to a trade agreement which is much more favorable to the United States and equalizing the tables between between the United States and Mexico. And now Canada has joined it. So NAFTA has been fixed greatly by President Trump.
A mixed answer on the overall question. I believe in international engagement. I believe in international trade. I believe in international cultural exchange. I believe in people visiting each other. I believe in economic interchange. I believe that as we reach out to and interact with the rest of the world, our country is stronger and our world is better. And what I am completely concerned about is a trend in our country which the president sometimes follows. And I'm about to say something nice about him, so let me say what I don't agree with. I don't agree with the isolationism tendency that he brings to it. I don't agree with many of the tariffs that he tries to raise, which I think are going to be counterproductive to our economy and a world economy over time. Now, here's where I do agree with him. I think that where countries are trading with us unfairly, in other words, they are making a deal with us and then not following the deal. China is the best example of this. China professes to have an open free trade with us and to interchange, but they don't follow intellectual property laws. They do a lot of reverse engineering of products. They subsidize their own products when they're not supposed to under our trade agreements. I have no problem with President Trump saying to China, hey, if you're not going to follow the rules, we're not going to trade with you. But the overall tendency of our president to withdraw from the rest of the world, I think is a dangerous tendency for our country, and by the way, for our state. Hawaii very much benefits from an open engagement with the world, especially with the countries of Asia Pacific.
Thoughts here?
Well, I think that the poor people of the world are the people that suffer when you have this kind of economic warfare, economic predation, where we're going after other countries and we're going to be ultra competitive. And I think we should be trying to help lift other countries and lift other countries up and you know, make prosperity all over the world.
Calvin?
Well, as far as tariffs are concerned, I don't know if this is a tie-in or is appropriate, but the Jones Act, I think, is something else that needs to be addressed as far as we're talking about increases, you know, as far as tariffs in a way, whatever. That's definitely something that needs to be talked about in earnest. We hear a lot of people talking in the past about the Jones Act, what should be done, should be modified or whatever. And it needs to be a very open, serious discussion about this because from what I understand is that the price increases, like say what we have to go through between 30 and 60% of what's happening here. And what that does, that stifles our economy because if you got to pay more, then it's going to cost you more as far as running your households and things of that nature. But I haven't heard, I mean, I may be wrong about this and please correct me, but I haven't seen any really serious, you know, look at this and really address it in a way that's going to be appropriate, you know, for the Hawaiian people and our economy.
Did you want to
I agree with Calvin. I think that the Jones Act is a far more pressing issue for Hawaii specifically as a state. I think we're far more affected by that. And data, Grassroots Institute put out a study that said it was about 30 to 33% cost of living increase just simply because the Jones Act exists and we have to have our goods overshoot us to go to the mainland first. So I think that for us, as far as like Hawaii's interest, I think we should be looking at adjusting the Jones Act before we're really worried more about the NAFTA, because that's really, I don't know, NAFTA just feels very mainlandy to me as far as like the movement of goods. You know, it comes out to us from California, but I'd be more interested in seeing, you know, things from Australia and New Zealand not overshooting us by double and coming back.
Well, let's talk about an issue here that I think is pretty top of mind for a lot of people here in Hawaii. Getting to one of our viewer questions, this is from Julie. What would you recommend on a national level to address rollbacks on addressing climate change?
Well, this is an area where I do disagree with our current administration. I believe climate change is real. I believe that climate change is scientifically correct. And even if, excuse me, and even if there is a little doubt about it still, I'd err on the side of climate change because the consequences of just sweeping it under the rug as we have for decades now are becoming incredibly apparent. I mean, we're having one of the hottest summers ever throughout the world. People are dying out there. You know, we can argue about this all day. The bottom line is that whether climate change is happening or not, and I think it is, we are emitting far more carbons into the air than we ever have on an accelerating basis. Our country, China, many of the industrialized countries. I thought it was a mistake to pull out of the International Convention on Climate Change. I thought it was a mistake to try to denigrate the science inside the federal government agencies. And you know, this is one of those areas, this is not going to go away as an issue. I'm sorry, as much as people want to say it's not, you know, it's just, we should just ignore it. I'm not one of those people.
Calvin?
As far as climate change, excuse me, you know, they say there's several different causes for it. It could be natural, you know, but when you have the government use a cause, you know, when they're tugging your heartstrings about the polar bears and all these different things anyhow, is there really, I mean, is there justification? Because it seems like there's more regulations that come about when they have these different issues, especially with the, you know, concerning climate control. I'm not versed in it, but you know, from what I see, there needs to be, I mean, you can't deny it, there is climate change coming about, but what's causing it, and is the government or, you know, state or local going to do something like, say, to capitalize on that to make us pay more in some form or fashion? You know, we have carbon taxes, things of this nature, you know. So, like I say, I've still got a lot to learn, but just on the surface, you know, that's what I see.
I'll dispute Ed's conclusion. I've heard too much on the other side. I've heard too many questions in science. I think it is still not a resolved science. There is not the evidence for global warming that many claim in the press and Ed refers to. So I think it's a mistake to change our economy, and, as Calvin has pointed out, and cause our people to suffer financially for something that's not known. And the United States has already reduced our carbon more than any other nation in the world. And those who came and signed the agreement were not following it. So the president was wise to terminate that agreement. And I'm glad to see us moving in a new direction.
You disagree that that climate change is a scientific...
I do.
Okay,
I do.
But would you, nonetheless, would you agree that we need to control our carbon emissions internationally? Would you agree with that?
Not necessarily. I would agree that it would be helpful to do so, but for us to force other nations is not our place to do so. And so,
well, that's an international treaty that we're talking about.
Yeah. So no, I'm not in agreement.
Would you be in favor of an international treaty that was followed fairly to restrict carbon emissions across the world?
I'm not convinced that carbon emissions are the cause of what we're experiencing right now.
Okay, but I'm trying to focus on carbon emissions themselves. So you consider carbon emissions to be bad, and should we do something about it internationally?
Carbon emissions are a reflection of different economies around the world, and many nations and growing nations are dependent on a new economy, an industrialized economy, and it's not our place to tell them that they cannot do so. So no, Ed, I do not agree with your premise.
With an international
I do think convention. I know this could probably go on and on, I'm certain, but I do want to make sure that I get everybody else a chance to chirp in.
I think that the alternative fossil fuels has been demonstrated to cause health problems for us. You know, the human race, black lung is well documented for mining coal, for example. That's a really simple example. Everybody can, it's empirical. And so I think it's important that we start looking at investing in sustainable, non-damaging resources for our energy, and that will have its own trickle-down effect into the climate change. If we're using less carbon emissions, which if you breathe in carbon, it's going to build up in your lungs. It's just like, so it's not healthy for us as people to breathe it in, whether it's climate change or not. We should look at it as a problem regardless of whether we agree with the science. So I think it's really important as a federal government that we start pushing hard and pushing in a way that allows everybody access to like solar power, for example, or an electric vehicle, to where we can reduce these emissions if we want to.
So when you say everybody having access to it, what exactly do you mean by that?
So for example, when I owned a home on the mainland and I looked into solar panels, the expense of solar panels to offset my electric use exceeded the value of my home. So I would have to get another mortgage greater than the value of the one I have for my home just to offset my own carbon emission. And so having a federal, maybe a federal guideline that pushes the utility commissions to go towards more sustainable uses on their own instead of leaving that to the individual homeowners and allowing people to maybe elect to use that plan, for example. I know they have that on the mainland and maybe here, where you can elect to use solar power.
Did anybody else want to chirp in?
Well, I just want to say, you know, that I'm Green Party, so these issues, the earth science, environmental science, this is like really the pillar of my campaign of what I'm running on, is that, you know, I'd be taking up more time than we have if I were to tell you everything.
Well, addressing this particular question then on rollbacks on addressing climate change.
Yeah, the rollbacks is, I think, probably pretty obviously to benefit the, you know, his big business energy friends or whatever. I don't know.
Did you want to?
Yeah, real brief. They were talking about, they say we have to cut back on different things and try to develop more sustainable energies and everything else. But what a lot of people don't realize, or, you know, may not be common knowledge, there have been a lot of technologies that have been developed. But unfortunately, what happens is that we have big businesses that turn around, take that technology, and shelve it. We have an opportunity in a lot of cases. I mean, the research is out there. It's not tinfoil hat things of that nature anyhow. These are actually things that have been developed, but they're not allowed on the market. And there is a federal law that there's certain things that if you develop, if you make it out to the public, you will go to jail. I mean, that's on the books. This is not, you know, hearsay or anything else, but it is on the books, a federal law concerning energy development, things of that nature anyhow.
Let me move on to another topic. This is also from one of our viewers, Tom in Honolulu. Universal health care. For it, against it, why or why not?
Well, you know, they when you go to file your taxes, they ask you if you have health insurance, and if you answer no, then they actually charge you more money. So I guess that was the benefit of the Obamacare, was that anybody that doesn't have you know, health care gets fined. So I don't see how the government's helping you doing that. You know, there are people here in the state who pay taxes, and
I believe that's no longer the case, though, as far as there being a mandate. So. Oh,
is it really? Did they change that? I don't know. But you know, there are people that pay taxes but do not qualify for the free health insurance or the government health and the Obamacare program. So I don't know. There's a lot of talk about Obamacare.
Anybody else want to jump in? Universal health care?
I'm for it. I'm for it. The main reason being is that with our society and our culture, I mean, the way things are going in our environment, there's so many things that are pollutants that we're not aware of. And I think that as far as the different corporations, and you're not going to get into a long discussion about that, but I think a lot of people are not aware of certain things that are in the environment that are detrimental to them, you know. And that's why, like, in a way, I'm for universal health care, because we're not totally aware of everything that's around us, and it comes out of our pockets when we're not informed by the people who are producing a lot of the different elements in our environment.
I think the Veterans Administration is an example of universal health care gone awry. It's a government program, and it's terrible. And now they're trying to privatize it. Fortunately, the president is allowing them to deal with private doctors. And so universal health care it would be a mistake, a government-controlled program. We must get back to the competition, to free enterprise, to doctors who can offer services at costs that they would like to, instead of the inflated costs that are being caused by insurance companies and government programs. They're playing a game right now. So I'd like to see us follow and not go back to Obamacare. Stay away from universal health care. I think it would be a great mistake for us.
Before we move on, maybe I'm going to let Ed.
Well, you know, I mean, what are we talking about? That's a pretty loaded three words, universal health care. You could fit 10 proposals under that umbrella. So are we talking about a complete government program such as Canada has? Are we talking about some modification of our current program? Are we talking about quote-unquote Medicare for all? Single payer? Is it single payer with the government delivering the services, or is it single payer with the private sector continuing to deliver the service? You know, this is the kind of stuff that you've got to hash out in Congress. You've got to listen to it, consider it, try to understand how it's affecting the country. And by the way, Hawaii, because mention was made earlier of our Prepaid Healthcare Act, which I think has been a quite successful law, one of the revolutionary laws we produced in Hawaii. We should be proud of the Prepaid Healthcare Act. So if we're going to pass, you know, universal health care on the national level that is going to destroy prepaid healthcare in Hawaii as we know it, as it's worked, then that doesn't sound very good to me. But if we're trying to create the best of both worlds and, you know, provide fair, accessible, quality healthcare to every citizen in this country, I'm completely for that.
So much in flux right now when it comes to healthcare. All right, speaking of loaded questions, here's another one for you. This is from a caller from Honolulu. Who would vote to impeach Trump?
In what regard? You can't just.
Yeah, you need to
have an issue to.
You need to have due process of law. I mean, there needs to be, you know, some kind of indictment or something from at a lower court. You know, especially you're asking about. You know, we have problems with war criminals operating openly. You know, what's this Syria guy, Bashar al-Assad, and you know, you have the World Court, and they can't.
I think one area where that's been brought up recently is with the Russia investigation, and that's one of the questions that we had as well too, as far as Congress moving on that right now, as far as restrictions on Russia, the president not necessarily or not agreeing with what Congress is trying to push forward right now. Lot of spectrum opinions on what type of sanctions, to what degree. In that realm, I think this question is currently the most relevant. Your thoughts on that, as well as where Congress is right now and what they're discussing about sanctions on Russia.
Certainly not a impeachment, and the investigations that have been ongoing appear to be politically motivated and not based on fact. So he needs to move on. We need to move on, and we need to let the president do the job he needs to do.
Boy, I can't agree that the investigation by Mr. Mueller, the special prosecutor, is politically motivated. I mean, that's a real surprising statement to listen to. I mean, here's somebody that nobody has ever questioned his credibility. Nobody has ever questioned that he is out to try to find the truth, whatever the truth is.
You're talking about Mueller.
Yes.
Yes.
And you know, I do not stand here. I don't, based on the facts as I know them today, I wouldn't vote for impeachment if I was a member of the U.S. House today. But I'll tell you, President Trump is flirting pretty close to a line. For example, if he were to fire Mueller, or that, I would start to think pretty seriously about that, because that would start to be obstruction of justice to me. In terms of what's happening with Russia, you know, I think there's plenty of evidence that Russia meddled around in our elections. I think that there's plenty of evidence that Russia is not playing by the international rules, and I have no problem as a member of Congress in imposing or supporting the proper sanctions against Russia. But you asked what's happening inside of Congress right now. All that's happening inside of Congress right now is one big political war between Republicans and Democrats, and there's really no constructive discussion going on exactly what the right thing to do is in this country, and that's what we need more of in Congress.
Thoughts?
Well,
if not, that's okay. We can move on.
Friendship between Democrats and Republicans. I like that.
All right, let's talk about homelessness.
How about
This is one of our viewer questions, as well as the questions we wanted to ask as well. Hawaii having the highest per capita homeless rate in the country. Cities nationwide struggling to reduce homelessness as well. And Gladys from Haleiwa jumping in to saying, please discuss how you would address homelessness here in the state at that level of government.
Well, you know, this is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Please. Okay. I think, well, as far as homelessness, if you've been talking about building structures and things of that nature, there are a lot of good people in this community. They have some great ideas on how to bring about or to end the homeless situation over here. One, for example, like I mentioned, Glenn Martinez, a heck of a guy anyhow, came up with some very dynamic ways of addressing this issue. But he's been ignored. And the thing is, we have people in here, like I say, that want to be part of the solution. And because of either the system or whoever may be in place that's overseeing it, if it doesn't benefit them, they don't want anything to do with it. But homelessness, to be honest with you, I think it's a money-making operation. And a lot of people really don't want to address that.
You know, I think homelessness is one of those examples. It's a very good example. It's a very tragic and unfortunate, but good example of how your job as a member of Congress is to bring the full resources of the federal government to bear on a problem that your state, your county, your district is facing. And homelessness is a huge problem for Hawaii and for the 1st Congressional District, which is urban Honolulu in particular. And you're not going to solve it only from the federal government perspective. Your job is to figure out what federal programs there are or should be created and then fund them and then administer them in a way that they'll actually help homelessness. But your job is also to work with your state and county colleagues all the time. You don't go up to Washington and just say, hey, I'll see you guys later. I'm going up to, you know, be this national leader and legislator. You've got to stay in touch all of the time. I did that when I was in Congress previously. I regularly met with the state legislators, with the county elected officials and administration officials, and said, what are your problems? How can we work together? Homelessness has many different factors, from illness to start with, to people falling through the cracks of our benefit packages, and all of those things can be strengthened. But each of federal, state, county, and the private sector have a place to play, and you've got to try to make sure that you're coordinating everything. You're responsible for doing that as a member of Congress.
Zach, operating on Capitol Hill?
Well, you know, I ran for mayor in 2016, and, you know, so that's really my perspective, is more executive branch, kind of just get it done. I don't think we need more money. I think that we need accountability for where the money's going. You know, we have people collecting Social Security income, and then they're not spending it on an apartment. So that's money that could be going, you know, meanwhile we have, you know, city-owned properties that are going unrented. So that's money that could be going into the city coffers. You know, and the congressman is the watchdog. He has to watch, you know, all these agencies, the mayor, you know, and make sure that everything is, you know, he has control over the tax dollars. So that's the congressman's job.
Michelle, as a national representative dealing with this issue?
I think that it's really important to identify that with homelessness you have different types of demographics. You have cannot, have not, will nots, right? So you have different people that are homeless for different reasons, and you have to start identifying, like, what's the real problem? Is it that people don't have a job, or is it that people are bothered by the smell of someone who chooses to live outside of a home? And start to really identify where that stuff's coming from. And I think that healthcare is really important. I think that if people are ill and they need something to help them get better so that they can get off the street, I think that that's where the federal priority should be, is getting these people adequate care and hygienic access.
Cam?
I think I tend to agree with Ed, what he's saying. So,
all right. Let me move on to another viewer
awesome.
question. We're getting a lot of good viewer questions. This is from Glenn in Kailua, Oahu, and the Trump administration definitely getting their view on this one. Do candidates support Hawaii as a sanctuary state? The president's saying that he would impose penalties on states that do.
Again, making Hawaii a sanctuary state is introducing lawlessness to our nation. Introducing lawlessness to Hawaii. So no, we must protect our borders. We must have laws. We have laws that that say how people should come into our country, and we need to bring them in orderly, with order.
I have to agree, like in increments with you this time,
Okay.
and primarily I think just because Hawaii as a sanctuary state doesn't work in my mind. I think that it's really far to get to us, as opposed to maybe being right against Mexico or somewhere where people can actually get to us of their own volition. I mean, we've gotten to yes, you can get here in a canoe, but I don't think anybody would really do it nowadays. And I think that speaks to the word sanctuary. You're seeking asylum or escape from the circumstance you're in. And if you're hopping a $1,000 plane ticket, I don't know that you're looking for sanctuary.
Calvin, Zach?
Well, we
only have a few minutes left.
You have states that they will send people over here. They'll give them a ticket, you know. And as far as with the sanctuary situation, like, I'm all for compassion and things of that nature. But when you bring people in who are beholding on the system, that undermines a lot of local issues. Because if you have people that come in and will work and that will do anything they can, all right? And then if you have a local issue as far as, for example, like say with the Hawaiian issues, things of that nature, then you turn around and you tell these people, okay, first off, if you don't straighten up, we have people that can replace you. So, you know, I think that in a way it undercuts certain things.
Jump in, we're running out of time.
I mean, again, what does that really mean, sanctuary status? I've heard it described many different ways, but if what it means is that states and counties should purposely not follow federal law, then I can't support that. That's just contrary to our basic system. Now, if we oppose a particular policy, the place to do that is in the United States Congress and in the presidential elections and in the U.S. Congress elections, and to have that fight, but to not follow the law on purpose, that bothers me.
Well,
short answer.
I agree that like a gray area of the law is dangerous, and we should always try to, you know, uphold the law. I think also we should, you know, we might be living in an age of persecution, you know, where people need special protections. So.
I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question, but I'm going to have to get 20-second answers from all of you. Do you consider the late Senator John McCain a hero?
Yes.
Absolutely. A patriot, a hero, somebody that stands for a different politic that actually was getting something done for our country. He believed deeply in his policies, but he knew when the time was to try to work out a problem, to compromise, and he just did it exactly right.
He was a hero. He served our nation well with honor, and he's tried to bring balance to Congress, and I'll just put a tab in. That's why we need a Republican in Congress from Hawaii to bring balance to the whole system, representation from these islands.
Well, with all due respect, you know, I would like to say that I do think that he was an unrepentant sinner in that he committed crimes. He killed people in Vietnam, and he never repented of that. He was pro-war. There were, you know, so I'm sorry, I don't mean to speak disrespectfully of someone that recently passed away, but he was pro-war, and he never repented of that.
Get their comments in.
As far as me, I consider him a hero, and I recognize that service members go to war and they do what they're what they believe is right with their country and what they've been trained to do. And I think that they're doing their job, and when they come back, they should be offered compassion. I think that, I think he's a hero for what he did for our country and suffered for our country.
Your thoughts, Calvin?
I'm going to bite the big one on this one, but I'm a little bit disappointed because I'll tell you why. It has to do with the POW issue. A lot of people don't realize we left 1,200 plus POWs in Vietnam and Laos. Senator McCain, like I say, was instrumental in blocking a lot of legislation that would free up a lot of information that would help to quell the long-standing issues with some of these families. We have.
I'm going to have to have you wrap on that if you wanted to get your last thought in there.
Last thought, like I say, that's just my thing. I mean,
an emotional issue and a varied issue. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us tonight. We appreciate all of your opinions on these very difficult issues that you could be facing in the coming months. And we thank our guests. I'll thank each of you individually. Libertarian Party candidate Michelle Rose Tippens, Green Party candidate Zachary Burd, non-partisan candidate Calvin Griffin, Democratic Party candidate Ed Case, and Republican Party candidate Cam Cavasso. Insights will take a break next week as we prepare for our next Kako Hawaii Town Hall. The workplace, as we know it, is changing. Are we prepared to meet that change? Join us on September 13th for a live 2-hour conversation with educators, business professionals, and students about how we as a community can plan for and educate our children for the future of work. Insights will be back in 3 weeks on September 20th and will feature the 4 candidates running for governor: incumbent Democrat David Ige, Republican Andrea Tupola, Green Party candidate Jim Brewer, and nonpartisan candidate Terrence Taruya. Until then, I'm Laura Yamada for Insights on PBS Hawaii. A hui hou.